If you've been working with React, then you probably know that there's been a major upgrade with version 19. So in this video, what I'm going to do is show you how to upgrade your current project and also show you the new features and break them down into sports examples. So let's get started with the video. Right, so the first thing we want to do is the same with any upgrade is we should read the docs and understand what's going on. So I've already read the docs, but there's a few changes that we will be covering. So again, first thing we need to do in our React project is to upgrade, and I'll show you how to do that. You can see here what's new in React. We can click here, and everything underneath is basically what is new in React. So we will be looking at all of these in detail. What I have also done is, if you don't want to look at these examples, which are kind of basic examples and might not be relatable to yourself, then what I've also done is done sports examples in this Medium blog over here. We will be covering them in this video. So what I want to do first of all is get started, and let's bootstrap a Vite project. So let's go ahead and do that. So Control R, and it's just to create Vite app. So we can just do Control R Vite, and again, this is the one we want, which is React 19, and then the template we can just set ourselves. So if we press enter, and bear in mind I'm using the Node version of 20 for this. So again, we need a modern up-to-date Node version. So let's choose React. And this time we're going to do JavaScript because we don't want to worry about fixing the TypeScript issues. So again, we do cd into React 19 like that and run npm install or npm I like so. So this will install our project for us. Once it has installed our Vite React app, then what we want to do is then update the React version, because I believe it comes in React 18.3. So once this is done, all we need to do now is code space dot, and this will open up a VS Code editor for us. So let's expand this. And in here, first of all, first thing to do is go in the package.json. We've got our node module, so everything's installed. But React here, we have 18.3 and 18.3 in here. So what we want to do is upgrade them. So let me just zoom in a bit more. And now first thing we want to do is check the node version. So it's node-v. And what we want to do is actually use node 20. So now what we want to do is check all of the updates that we have for our packages or our dependencies. So let's paste in this command, which is npx space npm check updates -u. Press enter. This will give us a list of all of the packages that we need to update. So you can see here, React and React DOM can be upgraded to version 19. So all we need to do is basically run npm install, as you can see here. So let's do that, npm install. And now what will happen is everything will get updated to the upgraded packages in here, and that is how you would do it. So now you can see React 19 is working, so we can use the new features. And what we will do next is look at the first new feature, which is the action. Right, so the first one is action. So if you go into the blog of React, you can see here actions is a common use case in React apps to perform a data mutation and then update state in its response. For example, when a user submits a form change to a name, but in our case, we're not going to look at this. What I'm going to show you instead is in the blog. What I've got is, if I just bring my blog in here, this is more relevant to a sporting example. So essentially, the state updates by allowing asynchronous functions within transitions. So this feature automatically manages pending states, errors, forms, and optimistic updates. So it's to do with pending states mainly. Just think about that. Then you can think about a sports management app where we want to update players' stats. This is where actions come in, and this is where we can manage the state of the update process seamlessly. So let's go into the code. I've got this function here. If I expand it out, I've got the imports of useState and useTransition over here. So think about it here. We have the state of the stats, we have the error, and we also have the is pending state. But in this case, we can use start transition. So this will normally be set is pending or whatever it may be if it was in a state. But in our case, we are using this use transition hook. Let's go into it actually in the docs over here. You can see at the top above here. So all I did there was command and click through to the use transition. In the React docs, you have this sort of blurb here, which explains what it is. It says here, allows components to avoid undesirable loading states by waiting for content to load before transitioning to the next screen. So basically, it allows for you to update. Whereas previously we had the loading where we would use state as loading, is loading, whatever it may be, and then we show a loading spinner. But in our case now, we can basically use a pending state, and that updates and it allows to go to the next screen. So it allows components to defer slower data fetching updates until subsequent renders so that more crucial updates can be rendered immediately. So again, it's taking it kind of off the stack and it's letting it do its thing whilst other things happen. If you think about JavaScript in general, it's a single threaded language. So we need to essentially wait for everything synchronously. But in our case now, we can basically use the use transition to allow components to defer slower data fetching. So you can see here, the use transition hook returns two values in an array. So in our case, we have is pending and start transition. So if you hover over is pending, this is a Boolean value. And then the start transition is a transition start function. So what we would do is go back into here. The first argument is a Boolean. So within the array, similar to a use state, is a Boolean. And then the second one is the start transition. So Boolean React way of informing us whether we're waiting for the transition to finish. The second is a function that takes a callback. We can use it to tell React which states we want to defer. So if you keep this transition start function to hand, this will say true, meaning that we are pending something, we're waiting for something to happen. If this is false, then obviously this one won't work. So let's go in here, is pending and start transition. So if we expand our update stats, this is just the update stats function, but the main thing we want to do is handle submit. So let's look at this input value over here. We have an input value and say we wanted to update the score for a football match from 1-0 to 2-0 or something like that. Then all we do is we set this, then we click the button of update stats. Then this is pending is basically set to true. Disabled is only when it is in pending, so we can't update the stats further. Then when we do the on click or on submit, we call this function here, which is the handle submit. Then we use the second argument in this destructured array, which is the start transition function. In our handle submit now, what we are basically doing is we're updating the score. We're putting it into an is pending state now. So again, when this is disabled, it's pending, this is going to run. So the start transition, if you hover over it, is going to basically update the score for us or the stat for us or whatever it is. This again is an async function. If you look at our update stats function in here, this is basically a fetch request, or you can update the stats within your application, whatever it may be, but this is how we would work. So in our case, we've done an async callback function, where we would await for the update stats to update. And again, the value is going to be whatever's in the input value in here. This is just an async function that does some sort of update stats. If there's an error within this update stats, then we set the error. Otherwise, we notify that the update has been made. So that is essentially how you would use the transition. It is basically a pending state. So we have is pending. This is a Boolean value. And then we can do a transition. So it would kind of optimistically update the player stat for us or the score or whatever it may be. This is how it would work. So it uses the use transition hook where we have these two values in here and we can use them as we wish. So this is a new feature that we could do, as opposed to what would normally happen is if we wanted to do an update, we would need to set something to loading and then also re-render the component. But in our case now, we can handle our update within the use transition hook. So this is quite a good action. So if you go back into our blog, to summarize, imagine a sports team where we want to update the play stats. Actions can manage the state of the update process seamlessly. So that is a new feature that we have. And essentially, you can see here, I've broke it down further. Start transition manages the pending state during the asynchronous operation, keeping the UI responsive. So if there's anything you want to take from that is this bit here. It keeps the UI responsive. So we have our whatever the button input is and so on, and this player start, it updates it whenever that change has been made. So that is the first new feature, which is actions. The next one is new hooks that we have in place. So it is the useOptimistic, useActionState, useFormStatus, and we will look at them ones next. Right, so now we're looking at other new hooks in here. We first of all looked at actions, mainly using the use transition hook over here. So now next we want to look at use optimistic and what is that, and an example for it. So again, React 19 introduces several hooks to enhance state management and user experience. Use optimistic, so let's just look at this example here. Again, it's in the name, which is it manages optimistic updates. So it allows the UI to reflect changes immediately before receiving the confirmation from the server. And in our case, it allows sports apps to show immediate updates, such as team lineup changes or scores, while awaiting backend confirmation. So optimistic updates, which is what we're looking at. So, like this example here is our fantasy league app where the user can update their lineup and then obviously wait for the server to confirm everything. So, let's look at the example in our code. So, in my folder here, we have hooks, and the one we want to look at is use optimistic. So, again, we have the update lineup function in here, which is basically a React component. In here, we have a form. Current lineup is whatever the optimistic lineup is, which is a piece of state, and we have this hook being pulled in called use optimistic. So first thing we want to do is command and click through to the React docs in here, and we want to see what use optimistic is. So if we do command F in here, we can see two little bits of code in here that use optimistic. Now here you can see basically there's two pieces of code in here that it looks at, and if you're familiar to TypeScript, this will make sense. But essentially, what's going on is it takes in some sort of pass through, which is a type of state, which is generic. So it's a TypeScript generic. It takes in whatever the state type is, and then it kind of returns this argument over here. I don't want to complicate you too much in this, but what it basically can take is a second argument as well, which is a reducer, and then it returns this type in here. But normally it has what we showed in the previous video, which is a description that React would have, but in our case it doesn't. So again, something like this where it would explain what it is, that's fine if it doesn't. So again, in here now we're passing in current lineup, which could be like an object or an array, whatever it may be. That's what the current lineup is. And then in here it has two arguments like we saw. If we hover over this one, this is our optimistic lineup, and then this one basically is the action to update or set the optimistic lineup. So again, in here we have a p tag, which is our current lineup, which is what is set as, which is basically coming from whatever the page higher up is passing down as props. So we won't worry about that in detail too much. If we scroll down, we also have an input type. So this is where we probably would set our lineup to whatever it may be. So in our case, we normally would have a piece of state to set the lineup and so on, but we don't in this case. Then we have a button to submit the changes, which then submits this form action here. This form action is a submit action, which is basically a function that does all of our new lineup changes or our optimistic changes. Again, we get in the new lineup, which is basically getting the form data from our input in here. Then we set optimistic lineup. So this is the second argument in the function that updates the optimistic lineup for us with the new lineup, which is essentially what we set over here, which is in the input. Then we update the lineup, which is basically this function here. Think of this as a update to an API in the server somewhere that's going to update the lineup. So we won't worry about that too much. This will update it on the server side, and then on lineup change, which is basically another function, updates the lineup for us with the updated lineup. The point being, use optimistic. If we go back into our code, it manages optimistic updates, allowing the UI to reflect changes immediately. So it updates the UI first, and then it can update the server confirmation. So that extra 1 or 2 seconds, whatever it may be, it can update the server whenever it needs to. So essentially, the user will see that actually the UI and my lineup has been updated. And then after the server gets updated at some point in time, similar to like a webhook, but not the same. But for the user, so if I'm the user, I can see that my lineup has been updated, but the server might take time. Again, if we're looking at Fantasy Premier League or whatever it may be, the server generally takes time to update because we might have a match coming at 3 p.m., whereas we're at 2:59. And think about your user base then. Everyone's making last minute changes. and the server's going to have that extra load onto it. So think about using this hook in them sort of scenarios where actually the user can see they made the change. It's pending to make the change on the server, but the user can see it in the UI. So therefore, the user can then say, actually, I've made my changes and I'm happy with it. It basically saves your customer base because the user's not waiting for the server to get updated. They see the changes, so they assume that the changes are made. So that is where you would more or less use the use optimistic hook. The next one I want to look at is use action state. So again, use action state simplifies managing asynchronous updates by tracking the state of actions and handling errors. So again, it kind of streamlines the process of submitting forms or any data like player stats or match results in our apps. So again, let's go ahead and look at use action state. And again, you can look at all of these examples. This code will be available, and also the blog is available as well. So you can have a look at all of them. But essentially, we are using use action state. So first thing we want to do is, and what you should do is, if you are unfamiliar with some sort of new hook or whatever library you're importing into your project and you don't know anything to do with that library, how it works, whatever is going on, then if you use command and click, you can see what they have done. Essentially, a library is just a piece of code that is bundled up, allowing you to use their methods or functions or whatever it may be. So if you get used to this, it saves you going to the documentation and looking at it and understanding what's actually going on. So that's another thing you could utilize to enhance your speed in your developing career. So again, use action state takes in two arguments, and then this one is an optional argument, which is a permalink. So if you do command F, again, it doesn't have a description. So again, that's fine. In this case, you just would look at the React docs and see what's going on. So that's how you would kind of look into what this method is or what it takes in as arguments. So in the use action state here, if you look at the arguments that it takes, first one is a callback here. So this bit here up until the comma, or it could be null. Then it takes the initial state, which is null as well. And then the third optional argument, which is the permalink over here. So first argument, you could separate this into a separate function as well. This is the initial state. And what I'm actually going to do is copy this bit here, and we can add it in as comments at the top. So it might help when you're actually looking through it in the code base. So I'll just paste that in. So it's basically explaining what's going on. So that is essentially it. Simplifies managing asynchronous updates by tracking the state of actions and handling errors. In here, we essentially have a callback function that had the prev state and the form data. The form data is in this submit action function over here. So again, we get the stats from the input, similar to use optimistic. Then we do our update stats call, which is to the server. This basically updates the status or the stats on the server side. We won't worry about that too much because this server isn't actually a thing. We have our updated stats, and then on stat update, which is argument be passed into this component over here, we basically update the stats. So whatever the UI is that is kind of handling the display of the stats, that is what gets updated. But in our case now, we update the stats in this part here, and then the initial state is null. So again, now on our action state, it will basically simplify the asynchronous update because we are updating to the server, and we also have access to errors. And then we have is pending, which is the same as our update player stats, which is the in the use transition. So again, this is a Boolean value that you can use to kind of hide the button or gray out the button as disabled, because when it's pending, then we got some sort of action state being updated. So this is how we would use it. Again, we are doing an asynchronous function as our first argument starting from null, which is the initial state. This then would update some stats on the server, and using this hook over here is handy because what you also have is the is pending state, and you also have the error state. So it saves you from creating these pieces of state, having to handle them again, having to re-render the component again, and so on. So along with this as well, what also is good is you don't really need to refetch the stats because what will happen is this will update the stats for you in the UI. So if you look at here, streamline the process of submitting forms or data in your apps. So that is the key point in here. If you think about it from before React 19, that is what you would have to do. But now you can combine all of this into your own little function over here. Again, with all of these methods, what I'm doing is I'm keeping them within the component. But what you should do is separate this logic out into a reusable kind of hook yourself. And then you can then use these across your applications. So like, for example, if I wanted to use an action state where I wanted to handle if it's pending and also the error and also submitting the action, then these three arguments here, you can kind of return them at the bottom like this in an object. And then all you can do is whatever you've named it as, is you can basically destructure this and use it in each component that you want. So that is another helpful tip. So essentially, useActionState is good for managing asynchronous updates by tracking the state of actions, and it also handles your errors for you. So this is a handy one to look at as well. So the last one I want to look at in hooks, or the new hooks, is useFormStatus. So let's go in our blog over here, and I'm just going to copy this and bring it into the component. So if you're looking at it from the Git repository, then you can just look at this comment over here. So essentially, this one tracks the status of form submissions, including pending states and errors, and provides actionable feedback. So this is ideal for handling submission states in your forms, like player registration and score submission. So essentially, within the new hooks, we have access to one common thing, which is pending, which is a Boolean value that says, actually, we're doing the update of whatever the hook is that you are using. So in this case now, we are using form status, and in here we are destructuring pending from here. And again, whenever we submit a form, if a form has already been submitted and it is pending, then this button will basically get disabled. So that is the use form status. So if we command and click through to this one, it is essentially returning type of form status. So let's have a look at that. So again, the form status type could be pending or not pending. It's quite simple, self-explanatory. When it is pending, is true. When it's not pending, then pending is false. Again, we have data, method, action. When it's not pending, obviously everything is null. When it is pending, the data will be of some sort of type of form data. The method will be a string, and then action and so on. So that is how it would work, is just basically pending or not pending. So now we've looked at the hooks. What we want to look at is number 3, which is the new API that we have available to us, which is use, and we will look at that one next. Right, so the next one we have is the use API in React. So the use API allows reading resources during render, enabling components to suspend until a promise resolves. If you think about promises, they are either resolve or reject. So you can basically still read a resource whilst that is happening. So an example of this would be fetching live match scores and rendering them in real time. So let's go in our code, and we are looking at use over here. Let me just put in the example that I've got in here as a comment. We have a page in here. It takes in some sort of scores promise that is then passed into the live scores over here. So let's think about a suspense in here, which is from React, which allows us to kind of lazy load our components or pages or whatever it may be within the suspense higher order component. So again, we would see something like loading live scores. In our live scores function or component in here, we get our scores promise. In here, we have access to scores. Essentially, there'll be a few scores because there might be multiple matches on in some scenarios. So this is where we have the use API, which allows us to read resources during render. So again, we would scores.map. For each score, we get an index. We map a UL, which with each li, we have the key as index, which is correct. And then in here, we have score.match and then score.score. So essentially what would happen is it would enable this component over here, the live scores component, to be able to suspend, which you can see here, until the promise has resolved in here. So because we might have multiple matches on and we need to fetch all of them, then what we would do is we would kind of suspend the component until the promise has resolved. In here, this is probably an async function to an API that then needs to kind of get resolved before this component is then rendering and loading correctly. So that is essentially what the new use API is. And also to double down on that, let's go into the React doc for the use as well. If we scroll down to use over here, it says here, for example, reading a promise with use, React will suspend until the promise resolves. So we have, in this case here, we have comments, and again, we get the promise, we pass it down. This promise is whatever the comments are in our case. We map over them, and then this component over here is suspended until the promise resolves. That's the key thing here. So that is what the new use API is. What we're going to look at next is the React compiler. And this is an easy one because essentially now everything is compiled. So essentially, let me just copy this and I'll show you the code. So let me find player stats. Or in my case, I've named it efficient component because in the new update, what it is everything's efficient because everything is compiled correctly or already done for you, should I say. So no more of using use memo or use callback because everything here now in the React compiler optimizes code by transforming the components into highly efficient JavaScript, reducing the need for manual optimization again. So now in all of the components, essentially what will happen is something like this, which is basically we're wrapping it in react.memo like that, and that is not needed anymore because everything is done for you. So the React compiler is like the TypeScript compiler where everything is as optimal as it could be. So you don't need this anymore. So what I'll do is I'll comment this one out and export default of player stats. So it basically does the same thing now. So again, this is good because you don't even need to go into all of the components and add React memo in there, or you don't need to go in all of the functions and add use callback in there if it's an expensive component and so on. This is all done for you now. So that is the new React compiler, which is quite handy because you don't need to think about performance in that sense. You should just think about following the relevant principles that you have, like solid principles, your coding practices, your coding handbook, whatever it may be. Again, this is one less thing to think about. So this is efficient in itself now. So this is just a basic component, takes in some stats, and then it renders out the stats. That's as efficient as it could be in terms of the React compiler. Right, so the next feature that React 19 has introduced, or if you're already familiar with Next.js, then this has been around already with the Next.js framework, but we have server components. So essentially, a server component enables rendering the component on the server, which improves performance and SEO by reducing the amount of JavaScript sent to the client. So again, thinking about how it works in React, what we generally do is we have a build folder, which is everything that we have in our code base, such as this over here on the left. We bundle it all together. So normally it's npm run build or whatever the command is. And then we inject that into the browser. So web crawlers can't actually read what's happening on that page. So like, let's say, for example, we have upcomingmatches.com or something like that. And then the React app is single page application, which is client side. All of the bundling and whatever is on that page is injected into the browser on the client. So what happens is crawlers can't read what actually is going on with that, versus the server side application where everything is static. It's already been generated statically, and then that is then passed down to from the server to the client. So crawlers can actually read things like the metadata, what is the information on the page, and so on, which is again better for SEO and performance. Because if you think about something that is static content versus something that needs overhead to load on the browser, the static content is going to win because it's got the HTML already generated. So that is why server components have been introduced. So let's look at this server component, for example, and it ties in with directives as well, because before, when we was fetching data on the client side, we needed to use React hooks. So we need to use something like a use effect or useState, have some loading state, fetch the data, then have a dependency array, which basically does what it needs to do, and then render whatever it is that we need to render. But now with the server component, what you can actually do is do everything on the server side. This is then HTML that we can then serve to the browser. So again, if you're familiar with Next.js, this is was introduced in Next.js 13 or 14, I believe. But essentially, what it is export default async function of upcoming matches. So we don't need a use effect. We don't need any React hook. Essentially, the response is await fetch, whatever this is. We get the response and then we kind of pass it to JSON. And then matches is available as an array to map over and render our UI. So this is what a server component is, and this is how it would work, where we don't even need to use the hooks versus a directive. So again, if we go into this component here, and let me just explain what a directive is. So first thing is server components, everything is server component first now, and then directives is where we want to use client and use server. So in a component as well, we might want to have a function that uses use server to kind of do whatever the function is, but these directives are now available for us to use. So let me just copy this and just put it in as a comment over here. Essentially, React 19 introduces use client and use server to specify where components and functions should run, aiding the distinction between client side and server side. So if you think about this one, we are explicitly using use client because we are using a use effect. This is where we are fetching the data in the use effect, and then we kind of update some sort of state as well that we need. So in here, we would have some piece of state and do whatever it is that we need to do. And then we would render the data out. Again, this is all done on the client side. We're fetching the data on the client side. Or if you were trying to be optimal, then again, you could use the server side method in here. But in Next.js, for example, this is already done where you could have server side rendering. You could also have client side rendering. And you could have also something like incremental static regeneration. If you don't know what that is, I've got videos on Next.js to explain this further. But essentially, just picking and choosing how you want to render your component. Do you want to fetch on the server side because it's better for SEO, or is your application a chat application, whatever it may be, and it needs to be in real time? Therefore, you would need to do stuff on the client side. In that case, then you would shift the directives to a use client. But again, we should follow solid principles. We should create components that have a single responsibility. We should separate logic in them. Again, these are examples that have the logic within them, but what you should actually do is separate everything out, keep it in its own neat and tidy whatever folders you have. Again, we should unit test the individual thing as well. But in this example, this is to show you that we have directives and server side components. So therefore, what we should do is utilize these now, because we also have, again, if you looked at this one over here, the React compiler has now been optimized as well. So if you combine all of these things together, then what will also happen is your applications will become very optimal as well and very performant. So now this new upgrade is a kind of a game changer for most developers, because it takes a lot out of what they are doing, thinking about performance and things like that. Because one, you've got the React compiler, and then also you have server components, and also you have directives such as client components, and essentially that's what that is. Another thing I wanted to look at is in the blog here. Again, you can read this blog further, but we also have improved Suspense, which is enhanced Suspense with features like pre-warming for suspended trees, improving user experience during data fetching and code splitting. So again, pre-loading data for the sports dashboard, we can have something like this. Simply just wrapping it in a Suspense, it optimizes everything for us, and the Suspense has been optimized further. So you can look into that. So let's actually go into Suspense in our code base. I want to look at if there's anything changed in the React documentation. So let me command and click through to here. And if we scroll up, and actually let's do Suspense. And you can see here in the React docs what Suspense is. But here we have Suspense props, which has a fallback of a React node. a name. This is like the name will identify this boundary in the React Dev Tools. But again, yeah, you can just look in how Suspense has improved. So let's go into the actual React 19 blog itself and search for Suspense. And you can see here now we have support for style sheets, which we won't cover in this one. But here, pre-warming for suspended trees, see improvement to Suspense. This doc over here explains everything for you. So again, I can explain this now. So essentially, when a component suspends, React will immediately commit a fallback of the nearest suspense boundary without waiting for the entire sibling tree to render. After the fallback commits, React reschedules another render for the suspending siblings to pre-warm lazy requests in the rest of the tree. So previously what happened was when a component suspended, the suspended siblings were rendered and then the fallback was committed. So like this is what gets rendered, and then after that the fallback is what gets committed to the page in this sort of fashion in here. But now what happened is this and this is swapped. So essentially now what happens is the component suspends, then it renders whatever the page, then the fallback gets rendered after that. So you're not essentially waiting for this one to complete after this one has completed. So this is a good visual diagram actually of what actually happens where it kind of pre-warms lazy requests. So if you read this, the fallback is committed and then the suspended siblings are rendered. So fallback, committed, then the sibling is rendered, and this is the process. Whereas this could happen, you might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it may be, then the page gets rendered. But now it's each node renders the fallback and then the siblings get rendered after that. So that is quite an important update for Suspense as well. So there's quite a lot going on in this React 19 upgrade. This is why it's important to utilize and upgrade to improve your applications as much as possible. Right, so the next update is so the package React DOM has new static APIs. So if we go into the docs over here on React DOM itself, you see here we have server APIs, and there's a few here that we have. So we have render to pipeable stream, render to readable stream, static markup, and to string. So again, this is to do with the server side, anything to do with like Node.js. And you can see here this function or this method in general, render to pipeable stream, renders a React tree to a pipeable Node.js stream. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this one, but essentially, these are server APIs that are available as well if you wanted to utilize them. And again, an example of this is in our blog over here. New static APIs for React DOM provide more control over server-side rendering and hydration, allowing for more efficient rendering strategies. So again, this is an example where you want to stream live data for like a sports commentary app, for example. This basically handles the live request. So I've actually got it in here, and I'll cover this one, but not any of the others. So let's think we have this live commentary component, which is a React component, whatever it is. We importing this from React DOM / server. And then what essentially happens is you can see here that we get in the pipe, and you can go into detail on the docs on what a pipe is. But if we hover over this, render to pipeable stream, it takes in children's, which is a React node, which is this live commentary component that we have. And then it takes in options. So in our case, they will be the on shell ready and on error. So this will handle the errors. And then this will basically pipe the response here if the status code is 200. So again, if you're thinking about Node.js, we also need to handle status codes and so on. So again, this would be, if it's 200, then you can run this pipe. And what this pipe is if we look at it, is basically a Node.js writable stream. So again, if we look at the options in the render to pipeable stream, you have all of these options here. Some of them are optional. Actually, all of them are optional. But what essentially is going on is this is a React DOM server API that you can use if you wanted an efficient rendering strategy or streaming live data on the server side. So that's something to look at as well in the docs over here. So I'll put all of the links in the description below. but essentially there's quite a few examples in here of how you would use it. And you can see here, this is to do with express app.use. You get your path of this /, you get your callback in here. Then again, you will put in your first argument, which is your React child, or whatever it may be, and then you have your options in this object over here. So take a look at that one. This can come in handy if you're combining the front end and the back end together. But what we want to do is continue to stick with the React itself. So the next one, again, we have enhanced web components integration. So it kind of improves compatibility with if you're using web components, allowing developers to seamlessly integrate custom elements into your React application. Again, this is a web component. You can integrate it in like a live score ticker or whatever it may be. Again, this is a new feature that is handy for you, where it improves your compatibility with web components. And then the last one, which is kind of another Next.js feature as well, but now it is in React. If he's talking about or thinking about SEO, then performance wise, it is important in your component or your pages to have some sort of metadata. So now we have access to meta from React. So let me just go into the code, which I have done here, which is meta.jsx. This meta component now, if we click through to it, see if it takes you through to the docs, which it doesn't. But again, you can have the name and description in here. So name is whatever the description is, or the name you can put in as events, like that. And then the content is live updates for the championship game. And then your web crawlers can actually read that and understand what is actually happening on this event page component. Again, this is handy putting it in the top level here on a page. And again, it improves the SEO for your React library. So let's just copy this and add this in here at the top as well. So now you can just quickly read the description here. It introduces features for better asset loading and simplified management of document metadata, which helps with performance and SEO. So these are the 10 kind of important updates that I would recommend having a look at. And hopefully this has helped with the sports examples, because reading documents like, or documentation like this, can be quite overwhelming, and it's just a case of getting used to reading this type of documentation. And then again, if you want something more simpler and readable, then this video hopefully helps, and also this blog over here, where I will also attach this video to as well. So hopefully this helps. And I've also done a conclusion in here of at the bottom of it's a game changer. Again, there's quite a lot of performance benefits to doing this upgrade, which is very important, such as your Suspense, such as your Directives, such as your server components, your React compiler. Even just upgrading it just for them is enough, which is not a major change to your code. I mean, you might need to remove the use memos and so on across your application, but that itself will massively improve your code base. And then you have access to these new hooks that will probably take some time getting used to. But the key one is in the hooks is this pending state as well, which is a very key Boolean value that we can then use to make updates, or whatever the hook is that you're using to make optimistic updates, updating the action state and so on, along with this use transition as well. So you've got quite a lot there going on, and this video was just to help you understand it a little bit better using examples from the sports industry. So all I can ask from you is if you can like and subscribe this video, and also share. If it helps you, please comment below. Again, I will try and engage with as much comments as possible, but if you're one of the subscribers or want to help others out, please feel free to do so, because again, I'm in the industry, so I work in my role, but each time what we need to do as a community is also constantly learn and improve and look for new ways of working and learning, which is what I try and do and help others with. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.